the knowledge which corresponds to the nature and character of the cosmic mind is such as can be procured from all the sensible things in the cosmos. But the knowledge which corresponds to the character of the supreme God's mind, this knowledge, and this alone, is truth. And of this truth, not the faintest outline or shadow is discernible in this cosmos. For where things are discerned at intervals of time, there is falsehood. And where things have an origin in time, there errors arise. Thought, however, differs from mind in this respect, that our thought attains by mental effort to the kind of knowledge which corresponds to the character of the cosmic mind. And having come to know cosmic things, it furthermore attains to a knowledge of eternity and the supracosmic gods. And thus it comes to pass that we men see, as through dark mist, the things of heaven, so far as this is compatible with the conditions of the human mind. Our powers, when we aspire to the sight of things so high, are limited by narrow bounds. But great is man's happiness when he has seen that vision. So that's a beautiful passage in Asclepius. This was translated in the Academy in Florence under the Medicis into Latin from the original Greek, which was itself probably from some kind of Egyptian originals, and it survived because people had brought it from Byzantium to Italy. And although this Semitic scripture had always been known in certain intellectual circles in the Byzantine church, it had largely been lost in Western Europe. So when it was retranslated in Florence in the 1400s, it was like a light going off. And it led to the Renaissance intellectually, because the great scholars of Renaissance Italy, including polymaths like Leonardo da Vinci, who we celebrated here in a couple of events, and who's buried not far from me, but also the savants like Ficino and many other great thinkers, and in Britain John Dee and others. These were all Hermeticists because they'd studied these texts and they were reconciling them with the Bible and realizing they go back to a common source. And that's what really kick-started the scientific revolution in what Francis Yates calls the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. The idea that science and spirituality are not at war with each other but can be reconciled if only we have the right method of procedure, which is scientific method. But it's also what I call transpersonal method, because it's not purely materialist. The science that the Hermetic tradition points to is not, it is materialist, but not exclusively and only so. This was the fatal error of Marxism and dialectical materialism. Dialectics itself has its own tradition and lineage, and it's interesting that Hegel knew this text intimately. Hegel was a Hermetic philosopher, as contemporary intellectual historians have uncovered by looking at his correspondence and his reading lists and so on. And he what we call Hegelian philosophy is really just Hermetic philosophy put into non-picture language, put into metaphysical discourse. Anyway, what's interesting about this text, and it's as if St. Paul had read it, because he uses the same image of looking at things through a glass darkly. In this visible, sensible world, we can't see the cosmic origin of things. We just catch glimpses. We can't see the workings of divine mind. We're obsessed and obstructed by our glitter and glare that surrounds us. Yet if we raise our mind, our consciousness, to thought, to pure thought, which is the function of the intellectual, we can catch a glimpse outside of that. And I know many people in the so-called loosely New Age movement are sceptical of intellectuals and thought. However, I beg to differ. I think the role of intellectuals is extremely important to make sure that the visions that people have are not false and not fake. We need discernment. We need an evidential process for understanding the trickeries of the mind, because I know there are very many people that think Brexit is the best thing ever, and they'll draw on all kinds of cosmic proofs and number synchronicities and all kinds of what I regard as bogus type of explanations to explain that Brexit is the best thing since white bread. Okay, so no, as a philosopher and intellectual, I'm saying let's rise up our minds to look at this thing ethically in depth, and we'll realise, we'll see through the illusion that Brexit, it's a fake concept produced by dark intelligence forces, it seems to me, which is another word for nescience. So it should be opposed. And the reason to come to texts like the Bible or the Hermetic scriptures and others is to free us up from ignorance, so that we can collectively as a people in Britain clamour for a second referendum, because we want and deserve the right to be given that whole question again. And the oath of Cameron is a fake, it's unlawful, just as Jephthah's desire to kill his daughter was. It's a human sacrifice of our country that should not be allowed to stand. I can't comfortably sleep at night as I know that my country is committing, self-human sacrifice. So, also on this day, I've also celebrated the lives and works of other intellectuals and philosophers from my universal calendar of saints and sages. And today is the 7th of July, the 7th of the 7th. And for each faith, I always have a collection. Today, for instance, in Buddhism, we celebrate today Nishitasu Fuji, 1884 to 1985, who was the founder of a very important order which puts these peace poles everywhere. He began to preach Buddhism very early on in his life. He travelled widely through China, Korea, Manchuria and Japan. He warned people about the growing militarization of Japan and militarism. The country was going down the wrong path, he said. And disciples joined him in the practice of beating a hand drum and chanting the prayer for peace, Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, in 1924 onwards. And he founded a temple for this peace order near Mount Fuji in 1931. He then travelled to India. He met Gandhi, and he worked with that whole tradition of non-violence. Through World War II, he regularly fasted and prayed for an early peace. And after the war began, he began promoting the construction of peace pagodas around the world. And there's one in Milton Keynes, which I've been to, and Battersea Park in London, where I've been several times. I wrote a poem about my pilgrimage there. And he's a great man. He wrote books like Buddhism for World Peace. And he died in 1985. And when I organised a conference in the wake of 9/11 at Harden in St Daniel's Library, founded by Gladstone, we had an academic conference in December 2001, and somebody came representing this movement, along with many other people, to speak. So I take my hat off to this great Buddhist, and the Japanese really don't want Brexit. They love Britain. They want peace. They want prosperity, which is for all of us a much better thing. So if Britain stays in the European Union, they're happy. What they've said is if Britain does this stupid Brexit, their factories will leave Britain, which I drive a Nissan car. I don't want my Nissan factory not producing any more Nissan cars. It's ridiculous. So please, for the Japanese sake, let's rethink. Then we have for today also David Hume, a great Scottish philosopher, 1711 to 1776. A skeptic, but a kind of transcendental empiricist. He was somebody I would have enjoyed a long conversation with. He was reading Lucian, a great philosopher and Hellenist at the time of his death. He was an enlightened thinker. What he wouldn't accept was a sort of bogus faith, premised on very simplistic arguments. I mean, Brexit he would have seen through in 30 seconds. He would have written a book against it by now and be giving public lectures in Edinburgh. I mean, he would realise that the UK is about to break up over this, and he loved the UK. He was someone that accepted the union of crowns and the Union of Parliaments, and he flourished. The Scottish Enlightenment, the British Enlightenment happened because of that union of countries. He was Scottish by culture, but he was European. He lived in France, he knew Rousseau, he worked as a librarian in Edinburgh. He was a polymath intellectual, and he loved his Greek and Latin authors. And, Hume would be kicking himself at the folly of his beloved country, committing self-suicide. Then we have Pyrrho of Elis today, who was another great skeptic philosopher from ancient Greece, who went to India with Alexander. He said, "Do you mind if I come on your trip to India, Alexander? I want to study philosophers in India." And when he got to India, he met Jains, who taught him about reincarnation. "Oh, well, that's fine. We know all about that," he said. "We've got Pythagoras, and yeah, we agree on that. Non-violence, yes, we agree on that." They also taught him this idea of suspension of judgment. Epoche, it became known as in Greek. And he brought this back to Europe. And it was a Jain idea that you should refrain from absolutes, that you should suspend judgment on things, because there's no final clarity about big questions, like how many gods are there? Is there a goddess as well as a god? Where does exactly the soul go after death? Okay, the soul seems to survive, but where does it physically go? Does it go into some other dimension around this planet? Or does it go onto some other planetary system entirely, down these black holes that seem to be wormholes? Does the soul travel faster than light? How does it retain memory if it doesn't have some kind of etheric body? Etc., etc. Well, the Jains would say, look, these are all very good questions, but we don't yet have the equipment to understand them. So let's develop what we can do and act ethically in the moment. Let's pursue non-violence above all. Let's pursue wisdom. Let's pursue equanimity and non-judgmentalism emotionally, so non-hatred towards other people. Let's try and find our way out of our immediate predicament, i.e. Brexit. Let's use clarity of thought to cut through this. And then we can join the stream crossing. Tirthankara is when you cross the stream of suffering and you reach the other shore, which is enlightenment, and which the Jains believe is attainable. Each of us can reach this state of joined up consciousness. I know many Jain monks and nuns in India who are highly enlightened people, who are both scientists and philosophers and metaphysicians and historians. There's a Jain university in Ladnan, which I've been to several times. I knew Acharya Tulsi, who was also the teacher of other philosophers and so on in Britain and elsewhere. And these people, Acharya Tulsi knew all the presidents of India since independence and Gandhi, and worked tirelessly for peace. And so now I'm helping with the Jains with their international conferences on peace and non-violence. We have another in India in December. No country in its right state of mind, if it was truly sticking to the Pyrrho of Elis epoche tradition and the Jain tradition, would willingly create conditions which will lead to mass violence for its people. This is self-harm of massive order. Social chaos breakdown that senior policemen, a warning would follow Brexit. The dislocation of England, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland back into separate countries. All the anxiety and angst that would accompany that. That's psychological torment, self-inflicted, needlessly, of a very high order. Suicide rates going up, poverty and impoverishment increasing. From a Jain perspective or a sceptical Pyrrho of Elis perspective, no country in its right mind would embark on that route. And one can only then quote the Greek dramatists that whom the gods wish to destroy, they first drive mad. And I'm afraid this is what's been happening to my country, but I don't believe the gods do want to destroy the UK. I think this is a great time of national character testing, and I believe we will come through this. We will get a second referendum. Enough moderate socialists will wake up in time to insist the Labour Party votes for a second referendum and campaigns for it. Enough moderate conservatives will wake up in time and realise that these Boris Johnson egotists are destroying all the genuine conservative ethics that they're supposed to believe in, which is conserving the country first and foremost. Okay, then we have also celebrating today Karl Mannheim, a great sociologist of knowledge who taught at the Institute of Education where I taught for some years. I never met him, he died long before me, but I always used to walk around that place with reverence in my mind for his work. Karl Mannheim lived from 1893 to 1947. He founded the discipline of the sociology of knowledge, and we need that to analyse the Brexit nonsense and to propose Brahmain. Because what Mannheim said is that ideas don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because they're held by groups of people who believe them to be true. You know, the Nazi Party didn't come out of nowhere. It had a sociological explanation of a kind of racism, a kind of economic insecurity, a sort of a cult of leader, you know, some occult ideas from various pseudo-area sophist teachings that my friend Nicholas Goodrich Clark studied for his doctoral thesis. All these things went into a sort of soup, and then they come out and it's the Nazi Party. Well, it's the same with Brexit. You put, you know, sort of racist ideas and anxiety about Britain, an ignorance, a profound ignorance about the constitution of the UK and the importance of the United Kingdoms of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I suggest we add the S to the name of the country. And yeah, you get, you know, the Brexit nightmare, coupled with this idea of David Cameron that once you give an oath you have to do it, because of his ignorance of philosophy. People like Cameron, you know, to succeed as a politician, you don't study ethics, you don't study philosophy, sadly. I think politicians should have to qualify under license like a medical doctor, and I think part of that should be studying political philosophy as part of their exam qualifications. At the moment they think going to Eton and Oxbridge, getting a degree is enough. I don't think it is. I think they need an actual license to be a politician or an MP or a lord from now on, because we've seen the horror of what happens when these unlicensed idiots seize power. Anyway, Karl Mannheim, great sociologist of knowledge, would explain what's been going on through the sort of peer pressure and the dynamics of social organisations. I think there's many serious questions to be asked about the Conservative Party, the Brexit Party, the funding of these things. These are vehicles for mass illegal activity as far as I can see. And they're conspiracies against the intelligence of the British people. And with the funding of things like the Brexit Party, it's shocking to see how a country can be literally hijacked in a coup in front of our eyes. It is like living through the 1930s, as so many other people are saying, but I'm saying that as an intellectual like Thomas Mann in Germany at the time, you know, we have to fight back. And I'm joined in that by Rob Riemann, this great Dutch philosopher who's saying exactly the same thing. Read his works. Then we have today the Confucian Taoist philosopher Wang Yuan. He was a scholar who was an official from his early years. He held an official post during the reign of the Emperor Yuan of the Han Dynasty from 146 to 168 AD, but then he gave it up and went to live in the mountains as a Taoist sage. And he became, ultimately, he reached a Taoist state of enlightenment and became an immortal. And he's one of the most popular of Taoist sages. And he would visit on the 7th day of the 7th month, which is today. And there's a beautiful story in Chinese legend and this chap is today's Chinese saint, and it's total coincidence it happens to be on the 7th of July, which is his day. The tradition is that at this festival of the heavenly weaver girl, they worship the star Vega, which is near the Milky Way, worshipped on the 7th day of the 7th month. Because this prince goes to meet his bride. It's celebrated in Korea and in Japan. The herdsman is the star in Aquila. The weaver is the star Vega, the weaver girl. They dwell on opposite sides of the celestial river, which is the Milky Way, and they meet on the 7th night of the 7th moon, which is a night held sacred to them, and that's tonight. And often throughout China, Japan, Korea, people celebrate with strips of paper with poetic effusions in their honour being stuck onto stems of bamboo grass and set up in various places. So I'm sure this is happening today as we speak. And the tradition is connected with this historical figure, Yuan, who is believed also to visit on this day. And the weaver girl was his consort, his lover in the mystical path of, Taoist Tantra, if you want. So I think this is such a beautiful festival, and there's ultimately the elixir of immortality can be consumed by these sages. Now, that's the kind of world I would like to inhabit. It's a world where we all realise our enlightenment, where we all realise happiness, where we meet our true consort and know the bliss of that sharing of the elixir of immortality. I believe that's possible in this world. I'm a believer in the reconciliation of heaven and earth, that cosmic mind that the Hermetic scriptures talk about. We humans can perceive it, and it says as much, if we aspire through developing our thought, our intellect, our pure aql, as the Arabic term has it. All the religions of the world confirm that. But so to do something so unintellectual, so unintelligent as Brexit, to me is a metaphysical, error of a cosmic, proportions. If let's just say a thought experiment. The world as we know spins on its axis. It's tilted, many degrees off straight, but it happily spins around, going around the sun every year. We're now in the summer here, but in the southern hemisphere of New Zealand and so on, where my friends are down there, it's winter, South Africa. So the whole thing's in balance. It's beautiful. It's like a divine mind had planned it, which is what I believe. Now imagine you had a lever. You were given the devil's powers. You had a lever that could totally change the orbit. You could throw the planet Earth either much too close to the sun or further away, so that it either burns up or it goes very cold. You could change the orbit so it no longer goes round symmetrically. And you've got that power, you're holding the lever, and the devil is saying, pull the lever, it'll destroy life on planet Earth. Would you pull that lever knowing everything about the consequences? I think there are some people that are so ethically ignorant, so badly educated, badly uprisen, who have such a criminal, pathological kind of temperament, that they would say, yes, I'll throw the lever. I hate life, I hate the planet, I hate human beings, people are ignorant. Well, the ants will survive, let's change it by 10 degrees, kill all the people, mass fires, and then the ants can take over. Some people would think like that. Well, it's called nihilism in philosophy, and it's called ethical nihilism, which is close to the idea of annihilation. It's annihilationism. Fortunately, it's a very, very small number of people that adhere to this, because it's actually the active pursuit of evil as a cause in and of itself. It's interesting to read some of the early essays of Mao Zedong, because he was tempted by that absolute nihilism. He wanted to destroy all that was good about Chinese Confucian and Taoist philosophy and transform it all into his kind of idea of what was right, which is why he completely ignored all ethics in his barbarous persecution of the middle classes in China and the intellectuals. So he is an example of the dangerous consequences of a nihilistic path pursued by a politician. Unfortunately, the Chinese current rulers have turned their back on that and are much more humane, and they've tolerated a rebirth of the study of Chinese philosophy. In his day, he didn't. It was cultural war all out, killing of anyone that deviated from his line. Well, So I find the Brexit lot to have the same intolerance that Mao Zedong had. They're fanatics, and they have their finger on this trigger of annihilation. All the evidence is shown to them again and again, which they either refuse to see, or they're so brainwashed that they literally can't see it. So we're living in very dangerous times. I'm trusting in, as it said in that wonderful psalm, that you know, if we retain our faith in the divine law, the wisdom inherent in human beings will shine forth, and we won't be disappointed. Now I'm going to end with finally a poem of my own. I've quoted loads of other sources. I just want to share a poem because, don't forget, I am a poet as well as a philosopher and a historian. And this I wrote a few years ago in 2014 in Miletus, which is one of the cities which saw the birth of philosophy. I went there on pilgrimage. It was a great honour. I had a chance to go. I was invited to give a talk in Istanbul and so on. So I went to Miletus. And it's an amazing city. It's where Thales came from, one of my favourite pre-Socratic philosophers. Karl Popper liked Parmenides, and he wrote about Parmenides, and I love Karl Popper's work as well as a philosopher. He founded and made important the philosophy department at the LSE. I think I prefer Thales to Parmenides, but I love them both. Like Popper, I like the pre-Socratics. So this poem I wrote in the theatre at Miletus, which is still standing. The whole site is now ruined, it's abandoned, there's no city there, there's a gift shop and a museum. You can wander around the old deserted streets and you can come across this theatre, which is, I mean, it's good enough that you could perform plays there still. I'd love to put on one of my plays in that theatre. The sea has now receded several miles, so what used to be a harbour town, which was a very important centre for trade in the Aegean and Mediterranean, is now, there's no sea for many miles. But it's possible in the mind's eye to remember how it must have been in the days of Thales. And I discovered also that it was partly founded by Minoans from Crete. They found archaeological remains in Miletus and Ephesus, just up the road, that they were both set up as Cretan colonies, which I find absolutely fascinating because the Cretans love their dolphins. Apollo is the god of dolphins. Apollo is the god of philosophy that Thales and Pythagoras and Parmenides all worshipped. Peter Kingsley says in his amazing book, The Dark Places of Wisdom, that Parmenides was a priest-seer in the tradition of Apollo. I think the case is proved. And as a philosopher, so worshipping the nine muses, it means indirectly we also are priests of Apollo. So, yeah, who was the god of light and illumination, and the equivalent of the Celtic god Lu, who was the Druid god of light at this time in the year. He's most prominent, and next month is named after him, Lughnasadh. So, no doubt we'll talk about Lughnasadh again nearer the time, but anyway, here's my little poem. This is an offering to Miletus. It's called At the Theatre of Miletus, 2014. It probably can't be said who's the best. Emperors come and go. In this seat was Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian, the usual contenders. Each of them had patches, dark flavours like wine soap birthmarks. Each of them angular and imperfect humans. Only hence divine, perhaps. Meanwhile, as the contenders chattered in some vestibule of the afterlife, the harbour silted up. The waves stopped lapping the new shore and stretched further and further out. The meanderings of time left us beached and brazen in the sun, sinking into old Mother Earth's bosom. The voices of the actors died away. The laughter, the tears, replaced by the birds chirping, the roar of traffic. Perhaps the pen really is mightier than the sword.